And now to one of my favorite subjects, our colleague Don Belt. He is an esteemed member of the Department of Journalism at the University of Richmond, where he has taught for many years. He also teaches slow journalism workshops at universities across the United States in partnership with the Pulitzer Center. He serves on the board of the Out of Eden Walk project, which revolves around the journalist Paul Salopek's 21,000-mile walk across the globe. Previously, Don was a staff editor and writer for National Geographic magazine, where he led the magazine's foreign affairs coverage for more than a decade and traveled and reported through more than 80 countries, including India. Don, over to you.
Thank you, Martha, and welcome everybody to this webinar, Environment Undone. Our look at the environmental issues facing India through the experience and the reporting of two very fine reporters who are both funded by the Pulitzer Center on their reporting. I think this is going to be a fascinating hour. For those of you who aren't all that familiar with India or with environmental issues in India, I think this is going to be just a fascinating education in what's going on there. It's a really important subject, and I'm delighted to have two really special people here with us tonight. I'm also very proud to say just a quick word about the Pulitzer Center. As Martha mentioned, I do workshops with the Pulitzer Center. Ann Peters, who is actually in the audience tonight, is my kind of go-to person at the Pulitzer Center, and has enabled me to travel the United States to universities around the country teaching workshops in slow journalism. But far more important, and on a much larger scale, of course, the Pulitzer Center it makes grants. It's a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., and they fund journalism of all types, all over the world. The sort of global reporting and the global issues that are reflected in this program here tonight is a really important part of their job, and they are one of the real bright guiding lights in journalism these days, in that as news organizations cut back on their foreign bureaus, et cetera, we're all aware of the financial pressures that are facing the media business these days. Organizations like the Pulitzer Center, maybe led by the Pulitzer Center, have stepped up and have made it their business to raise funds and then to support through financial and editorial resources people like our guests here tonight. Without further ado, I want to now turn to talking about our guests. Tish Sanghera is an independent journalist. She is based in Mumbai at the moment. It's 5:40 in the morning or 5:45 in the morning where you are. We're grateful to both her and Disha for joining us at an ungodly hour where they are. Back to Tish. She is an independent journalist. Her beat is the environment, economy, society, and the kind of intersection of those things. Her bylines have appeared in Foreign Policy magazine, Los Angeles Times, India Spend, which was one of the originating publications for this work we're talking about here tonight, Al Jazeera, Bloomberg, Business Standard. Her education is at King's College in London and the Sorbonne. And I put her Twitter handle there up on screen for everybody to be able to follow Tish. She's accompanied here tonight by Disha Shetty, who also, like Tish, is an independent journalist. Disha is coming to us from Pune, east of Mumbai tonight, or this morning where they are. Her beat is science, climate, public health, and again, the intersection of these important topics. She is an award-winning journalist. Disha has won a number of awards for her reporting in Forbes, India Spend, Vice, News Deeply, these wonderful independent publications in India, The Wire and Scroll, both of which I know and endorse heartily, Business Standard. She has a master's in education from Columbia University in journalism, and also a degree from the journalism school in Chennai, ACJ. Her Twitter handle is @Disha Shetty 20. And I am delighted to welcome both of them. The work that we're here to discuss is called Environment Undone. It's a series of 5 really important stories that were published by the Pulitzer Center, and also 5 out of the 6 of these actually were published in India Spend. So this is a really important body of work, and we'll be talking about that in great depth. Maybe Tish, if you would start us off by just set the scene for us in India. What is the status of the population of India, the kind of the trends that you're seeing there, and then I'll ask Disha to kind of add whatever she would like about the environmental aspects of the development and this growth that we're seeing in India now.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, so India is just a huge country, and it's a diverse country. I mean, it's called the subcontinent because it really is, this collection of 26 states, which are so different from each other in terms of linguistic differences, economic differences. So, South India, for example, is much less densely populated than Northern India. In the state of Uttar Pradesh has, I think, over 200 million inhabitants alone. So it's just, as you can imagine, a country this size, which is growing and developing very fast, there's a lot of pressure being put on its natural resources. And India is in this kind of stage where it's trying to become a middle-income country and really trying to ensure, energy access, food security for all its inhabitants. Disha, do you want to talk a bit more about what this means for the environment?
Yes. There are 2 geographic features that I want to draw attention to in India. One is the Himalayan region. So Himalayas, of course, the mountain ranges run across several countries, including Pakistan, Bhutan, as well as they go right up to China. And this is where the third largest source of frozen water is outside the 2 poles. And this is also the site of catastrophic climate change at the moment. So you, towards the north of India, have this region that is extremely densely populated, that even though is environmentally very, very important, gets very little attention because it is in the developing world compared to how much attention, let's say, the North and the South poles get, and as the climate change there gets. As well as there's the Indo-Gangetic plain, which is where the most densely populated regions of India are. And as Tish mentioned, the state of Uttar Pradesh. So the Indo-Gangetic belt is essentially this plain. Towards the north of it is the Himalayas, and that blocks the flow of air, and which is why this is also the region that is one of the most polluted in terms of air pollution in the world. And so you have these significant environmental challenges in the northern part of India that put all, and that's also a result of the growing economic needs of the country.
I must ask you, because just within the last month or 2, there has been a lot of news relative to what there usually is in the United States about India, about the environmental crisis in India. The farmers' protests that have been going on for months, the tractors coming into Delhi. This is kind of registered in the news environment in the United States. Of course, when the glacier broke and destroyed that dam up in Uttarakhand and killed all those people, that brought the spotlight briefly to kind of the role of climate change and the rapid development of dams along that chain of mountains to the fore in the United States. Also, just within the last couple of days, Tish tipped me off to this as it was happening, that a climate activist down in Bangalore, a 21-year-old activist, was arrested and hauled to Delhi on sedition charges by the government for raising concerns about the farmers' protests. I mean, she was an activist in support of the farmers. Can you just kind of give us, Tish, maybe a an overview of how these connect the dots for us and how these stories that we're seeing in the news in the United States might connect in some way to the work that you guys are doing.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So just to start off with the farmers' protest. So this set of protests has really been ongoing since about October of last year, and it came to a head at the beginning of this year. And this protest, it's really more of a challenge towards the way the current administration, the current government is pushing through its laws, which many of the farmers see as undemocratic. So, I mean, farming in India, the system does need reform because, as we may discuss later, the current crops that are being grown and the water intensity needed to grow the certain types of crops that are being grown in India, that is creating enormous pressure on the environment. So that does need to change. And also farmers are, some of the poorest people in India as well. So there are definitely reforms which need to take place, but the current protests are really about the way the government is going about those reforms. So they're protesting the way that the bills were passed without consultation, the farmers say, amongst them, and without really kind of putting their interests first. So yeah, the farmers' protest, I wouldn't say it's an environmental movement, but it has become linked to the kind of environmental activism and the groups that we have in India, because as your audience, your students might have seen, the farmers' protest, because I think the diaspora, Indian diaspora around the world, they really cottoned onto it. They promoted it on social media. We had people like Greta Thunberg and Rihanna and other famous people tweeting about it. The government has then sort of tried to clamp down on these outspoken activists, which tend to be from the environmental realm. So this arrest of this 21-year-old student activist, which we saw on Sunday here, she was, just a regular student. She was organizing, Futures for Fridays. She was very much part of this global network of students striking against the way that their government is handling the climate crisis. And unfortunately, it's become another way that the government has tried to clamp down on dissent. And people are saying, it's really an example of a democratic crisis happening in India, which is billed as the world's largest democracy, but we're starting to see a lot of, erosion around this, around free speech, really. Disha, would you like to add something about the Uttarakhand Dam project?
So the fact that the farmers' protest in India is receiving as much as international attention that it is all of a sudden, I attribute some of it to the fact that there is a change in guard in the US. So a lot of international journalists were focused on, and whether we like it or not, a lot of international journalism is done by organizations based in the US. And these organizations were so far focused on covering Trump a lot. And now that there's a change of guard there, I feel like journalists are now also, they have the bandwidth to write about other countries. Some of the pushback in India isn't sudden. It's just receiving a lot of attention now, but it has been brewing for a few years. We have seen erosion of democratic values, the clampdown on dissent for quite a while now in India. And domestically, I mean, I was at the UN in 2019 when the climate protests were happening in New York. And internationally, actually, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was awarded even by the UN for his role in protecting India's environment. And even then, there was a lot of domestic coverage in India about how it is not in line with the government's domestic policy here. So I see it as international media finally catching up with what domestic voices in India have been saying for a very long time. I also see it as a success of independent journalism in India that has really come on its own in the past few years. I mean, I personally entered journalism about 10 years ago, which is when none of these organizations that are now driving a lot of the coverage even existed. And so in the past 2-3 years, you've seen readers subscribe to many of these publications and fund that kind of coverage. So it's a combination of what's happening internationally and the rising protests domestically as well.
It's wonderful to see for those of our audience members who have not traveled to India or are not all that familiar. The media environment is quite something. I mean, there is a vibrant and enthusiastic media environment, and the rise of these kind of grassroots, these online publications like Scroll and The Wire and these others, the Caravan, for example, that are pushing independent reporting out and doing a lot of good. I mean, it's really quite an environment that you guys work in, even though you're under threat, of course, and we'll talk about that a little later. I wanted to turn for a second to just ask you to talk about your project a little bit. How did you guys set out to do this? What was your first move? How did you come in contact with the Pulitzer Center, for example, and how did you approach your editors with your big idea? And take us into that and give us a little bit of a snapshot of what it was like to get this project off the ground, as ambitious as it was, and with so much data at your, on the horizon that you guys had to. It's like climbing the Himalayas to make sense out of all that data that you guys took on.
Sure, yeah. So I'll just start by saying at the time that we embarked on this project, Disha and I were both working at India Spend full-time, and India Spend is India's first data journalism initiative. So they are a very, very small outlet, I mean, under 10 full-time staff, but they have a track record of doing these sort of data intensive projects and letting their reporters really sit down with big ideas and work on a project like this for months at a time. So our editor at the time was really on the lookout for something like this, which tackled a big issue and combined on the ground reporting with deep dives of the issues. So Disha and I, we started working on this, back in March 2019. And the impetus was really the fact that at the time, the government was talking about India becoming a $5 trillion economy by 2025. At the time, it was a $2.3 trillion economy. So quite a statement to make. And we noticed that there was a lot of focus being put on new infrastructure projects. So airports, railways, coal plants, hydroelectric dams, all this sort of nation building stuff, which they said would drive investment, create jobs, and take India to this point. So Disha and I were really interested, and so as our editor, are looking at what this actually means on the ground. So when a project is greenlit in a certain area, what does that do to the local environment of that area, to the indigenous population of that area, and how does it link to certain other issues that India is facing in terms of handling its air pollution crisis, water pollution, all these myriad of challenges that India is facing. So at that time, Disha and I were also really interested in the legal process between how a project is greenlit as well, because we had come across this interesting data point which said that only 1% of projects proposed to the Environment Ministry had been rejected in the past 3 years. So a little bit of background: if I want to build a coal plant in a certain area, I need to apply to the Environment Ministry for certain number of clearances and approvals before that plant can be built. So Disha and I said, okay, well, this data on the number of clearances that the Environment Ministry is granting and giving away is actually publicly available. The Environment Ministry has its own online portal and where it records all of these clearances. So we decided to look into these clearances and see where these projects are that are being approved, and if they are affecting any of India's multiple biodiversity hotspots. So that is how this map that you can see on the screen came about. And we have different colors for the proximity of those projects to protected areas, such as national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. So this map really indicates the pressure that India's push for development is having on certain important zones in India. So yeah, so that's how this map came about. But rather than just building a map and writing our first story in the series, which tells you about the situation with how the Environment Ministry goes about approving these, we also wanted to focus on 4 projects which take you from kind of start to finish of how these projects that are approved are not necessarily always the most well thought out or the most they can actually make the situation worse in a lot of places. So as we'll see later in the talk, we look at a coal plant, we look at a road, we look at a port, and we look at how these projects are kind of a lot of the times pushed through by the Environment Ministry, who, as we talk about in the first series, are actually starting to weaken the safeguards which are put in place for protecting India's environment. And we kind of wanted to document that process as well, because that really shows you how it's really environment versus development right now in India. And whereas India should develop, and we're not saying development is bad, we just wanted to show all the different aspects towards development and how that comes across. Disha, I've probably forgotten to mention a few things.
Disha, I want you to answer, but I would love it if you could touch on just the daunting task that you must have faced early on when you recognized that in order to do this project, you were going to have to scrape government websites, data, clearances, all these data points. That's an enormous job. I mean, how did you get your arms around that? So if you could just, in the process of answering or adding your thoughts, if you could just touch on that, I think for the data journalists out there in the audience, they might be interested to hear how you guys got your arms around this thing.
So when we initially looked at the data, it was quite clear that it was going to be an enormous amount of data. And we had a rough idea that we wanted to end up with a map like this. India's Pen has done previous projects, and they've also they've worked with formats like this. But it was clear to us that we'd need additional resources to scale up at the level that we were hoping that we would eventually end up. And so a lot of our project was shifting constantly, and it evolved quite organically over a period of time. To begin with, we didn't necessarily have all the resources. But for the data aspect, we collaborated with Pankuri Kumar, who's based in the US and a former student at Columbia, and I know her from my time there. And so I asked her if she would be willing to do coding that required for this map. We delegated some of the manual entry of the data. Both Tish and I actually spent a few weeks manually trying to enter this data on an Excel sheet. They were uploaded in a PDF format. And so Pankuri initially tried to scrape that data, and then we realized that the only way to do it, because of the format that it was entered in, was to manually copy it on an Excel sheet and then visualize it this way. So that process took us several months of different, like trying different formats of how to even get this data and how to visualize it. And we went through, there were several conversations over months about how we're eventually going to get here. And in fact, till about a week before publishing, we weren't exactly sure of how the map would finally end up looking and how usable it would be. And we were just sort of pushing boundaries one step at a time. In terms of funding, I had received a previous Pulitzer Center grant for one story. My earlier project was a climate change series for India Spend. And some of the themes that we've explored in Environment Undone is an extension of the previous work that India Spend has done in the areas of climate, environment, and energy. So with this project, we were trying to tie all of these links and really make the readers understand that environment doesn't exist in isolation. It's political, as is climate change, as is healthcare, and with a lot of these projects, there are obviously always multiple fallouts. And so it helped, I think, that Tish and I had both sort of reported on different aspects. Like Tish has reported on economy, I have reported on healthcare, and a lot of these projects had overlapping issues.
Right. You know, we're going to move momentarily to talking about your individual stories. And we got lots of questions, and we'll take some questions from the audience too. However, I want to begin, or before we go there, I want to just get you to talk for a second about the story that you published that made the point that these zoonotic diseases that emerge when humans encroach into wild areas, and you know, the disruption that causes, the environmental contact between humans and animals especially, but also these biodiverse areas can bring forth zoonotic diseases that have a severe impact on public health.
So that was actually a last minute pivot. We already had this incredibly deeply researched first story for our series, and we were ready to start publishing when COVID happened, when the lockdown happened, and we couldn't travel. And we also thought it was an extremely important, I mean, we were sitting on an extremely exciting project, and the timing was great. So we kind of wanted to push it out around that time, because just when the lockdown happened, Indian government started ramming through several clearances, several controversial projects without any discussion, public consultation, or giving the chance for local communities to give feedback. So we have a mechanism in place that allows stakeholders to give their feedback. But right, like literally a day after lockdown, India's environment minister started announcing on Twitter, we've approved several dozens of projects, and here these projects are. And so we thought this was an extremely important time to start publishing. Because we'd already done the reporting, and in our minds, a lot of these links were clear. It was just about making it timely, and as a journalist, I think that was a good example of responding to developing events and making investigations relevant. And so all we had to do was tweak first two paragraphs and just get one additional interview to kind of make those links. But the rest of our story was sort of what we had ready for quite some time.
Thank you. We have a question, I believe. Jackie, do you have a question from the audience?
Yes, we do have a question from Abby Clark. She's a University of Richmond student, and she asks, were there any times in gathering information that you felt stuck or wanted to give up? If so, what inspired you to keep moving?
Yeah, okay, I'll go first. The initial phase that we talked about, where we were just manually entering data into a Google sheet, that was so painful, because actually, you know, we were not just working on this project. Both Disha and I were also writing other stories. You know, we had to kind of keep delivering our other work as well. This was meant to be kind of a slow burn project on the side, but that manual entry of data was really like taking over a lot of our time. So in the evenings, I think both Disha and I would sit down and, you know, do a couple hours of data entry, and then again in the morning when we wake up. And that was quite a juggling process for the first few weeks. I think might have even gone into months. So that was definitely a low point. And Disha especially, if you want to talk about Disha, you were traveling a lot at that time. So I'm pretty sure you were close to giving up. Yeah,
so around that time, I was actually, I'd also gone to the UN to cover on a UN fellowship, and that's when some of my reporting there was happening. So I'd taken a month, not off, but I was basically reporting from New York. And some of that reporting actually also helped me with this project because I had a better idea of the larger picture, the global conversations, the climate protests that were happening then. And I think a lot of our global exposure shows in how we've been able to tie a lot of the local issues. I have to say that, initially when we put together several briefs, our editor was ruthless with us. He kept thrashing all our briefs down, saying, this is not good enough, this project doesn't work, this is not good enough. And I felt really like pushed to the wall, and I was almost like, what is he looking for? Like, what does he really want with this? And I'm actually so glad that he did that with us because, and he was right, because till we get the briefs right, and he kept saying, I will not let you proceed to the next stage till you get all your briefs right. And so we were just looking at projects and sending in these story briefs of what our series would look like. And we spent, I think, several months just doing that itself, and it getting thrashed, and then having to relook some of these projects. So that was quite exhausting in terms of, giving up stage. But I also think the other point was because the project took over a year, at some point, especially when COVID happened, and we'd been sitting on it for about a year then. I really felt a lot of pressure. I felt that, okay, now we have to get this out, because I've been talking to, and by that time our editor had changed at the organization. And I felt like we'd already taken a lot of time, and there was only, like, everybody in the team kept asking, when is the project coming out? When is the project coming out? And I wouldn't say it was pressure in that sense, but it was like for me also to just keep at it was, I felt like the need to start publishing.
And you guys started publishing last spring as COVID started roaring across the world. I mean, the timing could not have been more propitious and necessary which is why I guess you decided to make that really important connection to the contact between humans and the wild places and the emergence of strains of viruses and zoonotic diseases of one kind or another. I think what I'd like to do now is to go ahead and get started on talking about individual stories. Just for everybody's background, the four stories that we're going to talk about next in relatively short time frame, just because it's a few minutes after 8 and we only have till 8:30. But the coal plant, the rivers project, the road expansion, and the port expansion are located in these parts of India. I'm going to start by asking Tish to talk about the coal plant up there in the northern part of the country, and just ask you, Tish, to give us a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of what this project entailed and kind of what you found in your reporting.
Yeah, sure. So India is still very committed to using coal as one of its primary energy sources, because India has a natural abundance of coal, so it's very easy for it to extract coal and then to power its energy plants with it. But we all know, obviously, that coal contributes to air pollution, and India in particular has a real problem with air pollution. Delhi, as you may have seen, is every winter is just blanketed in this thick fog, and it's leading to children now being born with severe asthma and just lots of very related health problems. So I was interested that the government had greenlit a coal plant to be built about 90 kilometers away from Delhi, the capital. And just to add, Delhi is actually part of the NCR region, the Northern Capital Region. So Delhi has become this sort of like mega city of 30 million people, which has kind of consumed, like 7 other cities. So it's really this like mega city now. It's not really just Delhi. So this plant that's being built 90 kilometers away, there's a huge number of people which will be affected by that. And So I was really interested that given, the very well-known crisis, this plant has been given the go-ahead. And then when I was looking into this plant, I also discovered that the coal that would be being used in this plant is actually coming from this area called Singrauli, which is listed there on the bottom right-hand corner on the map. And Singrauli is also a very heavily polluted area of India. It's actually known as the energy capital of India because there's just so many coal mines and coal plants that already exist there. So again, I was thinking, well, if we're going to build another coal mine to operate this coal plant in Delhi, how is this region going to cope? And it's already so, overburdened with these pressures. So I traveled to Singrauli, which is in the neighboring state called Madhya Pradesh. And Madhya Pradesh is really interesting because it's home to one of the largest sal forests in the world. And sal is a particular type of tree, which is common throughout South Asia and Southeast Asia. And it's also home to a large indigenous population. So I met with this tribe called the Gond tribe, and they still live in the heavily forested areas of Madhya Pradesh. And underneath these forests, that's where all these coal deposits happen to be. So these people are really at the forefront of India's desire to dig up coal and burn it. They're being, they're losing their homes and their farmland. So you'll see in my story, I went to this area, Singrauli, and I met with farmers who, these people are, they may be able to read a little bit, but they won't have the knowledge of how to petition a company to stop them taking over their land, or they don't necessarily know how the legal system could be used to protect their rights. And these people that live in the forest, they do have certain rights. It's called the Forest Rights Act, which is meant to protect their land because they are the indigenous population which have always lived there. But when I went and spoke to these people, most of them didn't even know the name of the mining company which had acquired their land. They just knew that they were going to be relocated to a purpose-built colony, which I visited some of these colonies that have been built in the past. They tend to have no running water, no electricity, and these people who usually depend on the forest and the resources you find in the forest are suddenly transported into a semi-urban environment, and they lose all means of creating an income because they're not farmers anymore and they've lost their land. So yeah, this story was an interesting one to report because there's really two sides to it. There's the coal mining area and how the wildlife, this coal mining area is also home to elephants and tigers and just hugely biodiverse. So there's one side of the story which is looking at the impact of that area being systematically destroyed by digging up a coal mine. And there's also the second half of the story, which is, do we need to build another coal plant in one of the most polluted places in the world? So with this story, that was quite a juggle, kind of balancing that and moving the reader around from Singrauli, Madhya Pradesh, back to this area in Delhi and making sure that people don't get confused, and also drilling into how the Forest Rights Act that I mentioned, which is meant to protect these people from losing their land, or at least allow them to participate in the process and raise their concerns and get adequate compensation, is really failing these people. So I mentioned in the story that all the documents that I found relating to the land acquisition in this area, some of them said that there was no tribal population found in this area because according to these old land records that the state government was using, there was no one there. And that's really a failure of documentation that has happened in the past decades, but which no one has bothered to correct. And unfortunately, these people don't have a lot of agency to correct that also.
What I'd like to do now is to move on to Disha's story about the port expansion, and then come back to you guys to talk a little bit about methods of reporting. I don't know if we're going to have time to just touch on every one of your stories in depth. I encourage everybody in the audience to go read these stories. I mean, we are just hitting the high spots. in the executive summary of these pieces, because there is so much rich material in these stories. They're well written, they're incredibly well researched, and you guys have links out and documentation that brings just a wealth of material. Disha, if you don't mind just telling us a little bit about the port there at Karwar.
Where in the story, the idea was to look at issues related to coastline. And having covered climate change in this part of India and across both the coasts of India, I already knew that both the Arabian Sea, which is towards the western side of India, as well as the Bay of Bengal on the eastern side of India, is seeing extreme climate change. There's changing temperatures, fishermen are the worst affected, as well as agriculture is hit hard in a lot of these coastal areas because of saltwater intrusion, because of salination, and there are a lot of complicated links to maternal health care, for instance. So in this story, we're looking at how this region this particular area was supposed to be protected by the government itself. The government had declared it as an ecologically fragile zone. And then the government itself went ahead and gave permission for the expansion of the port that no one had actually asked for. And that was actually going to hurt the local fishermen, because at this moment, the port and the fishing harbor exist like they're right next to each other. And they're coexisting very happily. So there's some amount of trade that's happening. There's a lot of fishing that's happening, and nobody's complaining. And nobody's asked for the expansion of the port that the government wants to give, that the government then went ahead and approved. So here we come to the issue of how many of these policies are top-down. And so at the local level, there was no need for this project, but at the national level, there were push for certain projects that were seen to be good for India's $5 trillion economy. And so, and this is what we were hoping to do with all our stories, to make that constant linkage between what policy discussions happen in Delhi and how sometimes they're very detached from ground realities, and how a lot of environment projects cannot be, the call for them can't be taken at the national level. They have to be you have to look at local implications and repercussions of these projects. So that's one. Second, as Tish already pointed out, in her story as well, she was looking at communities and how communities were put in this position where they had to defend their rights. And these are communities that are already marginalized. They're communities that are poor, they're communities that are suffering, and then they have the job of defending themselves, and not the state. The state is not doing that job of defending them. And this is a theme that I have run through, not just in my environment reporting, but also in my healthcare reporting, that it is not fair ethically to put a community at a position where their job is to defend themselves. And having said that, in the Karwar story, actually, the communities are doing a good job. They're poor local fishermen who've taken the government to the court. And so they're having a court battle with the government. One of the things, and there's a question also in the chat box that talks about, how did we go about getting these voices, or whether there was an active thought about voices. And that we were very clear at the outset with this project that we want to give voices to local communities. That yes, and having personally covered a lot of these global conferences, that yes, certain voices from the global from activists, from politicians is always amplified. But we wanted to make sure we talk about how these communities are just like you and I, that, just like the government can't ask us to just vacate our homes, how can we ask a tribal community member to vacate their home? How is that fair? And the crux of this story particularly was, who is the development for? And who pays the cost of development? And the idea was to talk about the power equation that me as a city dweller has versus somebody, and why should somebody else's livelihood suffer because me, or someone like me wants more power, because it's through these ports that the coal is coming in, and that the trade is happening. And of course, we also go into the complicated rationale of, do we even need so many ports? And actually, we came to the conclusion, and I think something similar happened to Tish's coal story, that India might not need these infrastructure projects. And the public opinion over the years have been built in favor of how, without these projects, growth is not possible. And over again, we came across the theme that we can actually have growth, and these projects are not as essential as it's projected, as they're projected to be.
And the growth you're talking about is a commitment by the government to grow the economy to like $5 trillion or something, right?
So essentially what we're asking is, yes, the $5 trillion economy. But one crucial question I try to ask here is, if you're taking local jobs away and you're saying you're giving jobs at the national level, who are you looking to give jobs to?
You know, there are other stories here in this list that we should talk about, but we're not going to have time because I want to get to some of the journalism type questions. Both your story on the Western Ghats and on the Ken Bentwa River are fantastic, and I recommend people go to read them. What I would now ask, though, is that we spend a little time we have a couple of questions in the chat that touch on this, but what are the obstacles? Tish, when you go in to cover that coal plant and the coal mining that's going on there, what are the obstacles that you face as a journalist, as a woman journalist, a young woman journalist, going into remote areas where there are these powerful vested interests in the mining industry and the government that want to make this thing happen? They don't want to answer questions from people like you, and yet you have to go in there and use your own eyes and your own ears and report on it. What sort of strategies do you use to get in, get what you need, and get back out again safely, given the sort of war on journalism that's happening from some quarters of the government these days?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So I'll use the example you mentioned when I was traveling to Singrauli, India's energy capital. This is a very politically sensitive area because so I was traveling in 2019, and in 2015, there was a huge campaign led by Greenpeace there to save a particular forest area, and Greenpeace was successful in stopping, I think it was Essar, which is an big energy conglomerate. They were successful in stopping Essar from building a coal mine in that area. But as a result, Greenpeace have been increasingly sidelined in India. So the Indian government have frozen their bank accounts. They stopped the head of Greenpeace India from traveling to the UK at one point to testify in a UK government parliamentary committee. So you could say there's a lot of eyes on Singrauli because it's known to be a sort of like hotbed of environmental activism. So I was told that when I got there, you should just say that you're working with an NGO on, say, maternal health or teenage education, something like that. Just, you don't need to mention that you're a journalist, but you can say that you're interested in visiting certain areas for another purpose. Also, when I was there, I guess I sort of went in quite naive. I was used to planning reporting trips quite last minute. I would always plan out my transportation, meaning I would hire a car, and if I needed to, I would look for a translator because the area I was traveling to, they speak a certain dialect of Hindi, which I don't speak, called Bundelkhandi. So I looked for a translator who could help me with that. And
that's something that our audience may not know, is how many local languages there are in India that have to be navigated.
Exactly. And whereas you can generally get by in the northern parts of India with Hindi, especially when speaking to this tribal community, I knew that I would need someone who could speak the regional language. So it was actually, and she was also another woman, the translator. So when I met her at our starting location, we were driving from Varanasi, Benares, which some of you might have heard of. It's like a it's situated on the Ganges. It's a very, very holy place for Hindus to visit. So we were driving from there to Singrauli, and she mentioned, Tish, I'm actually going to ask my husband to travel with us because I don't feel safe as a woman. And she kind of really alerted me to the fact that actually I should take this a little bit more seriously. I think sometimes as a reporter, you're so excited to go out there and write the story and meet everybody, and you really are pumped with adrenaline that you often think that you are sort of invincible. So she kind of just took me aside and said, my husband's going to travel with us, which may seem a little odd, I guess, for journalists in the West, but that is the reality of India, is that it's not normal to see two women walking by themselves with backpacks, notepads and clicking photos, and that would draw attention to you in many parts of India. So I was really grateful that he came with us, and it did help, because basically what he could do was sort of introduce us to the local village chief, or just make that introduction, and then fall silent and I would take the lead. But you kind of needed that person just to open doors. So that was really great. And also just in terms of when you're planning reporting trips like this, rural India, you can't really use Google Maps. A lot of the place names differ from something that you've read in a report to then what you see on the map to then what you ask somebody on the street. There are multiple spellings of village names, and it just gets very, very confusing. So there's also only so much you can plan. So once I arrived in Singrauli, I actually didn't know the name of any village that I would be traveling to, because I couldn't find any village names in the official report. So I just knew that I was going to this particular forest, and when I got there, I would sort of have to suss it out. So generally you meet one person on day one of your reporting trip, and they say, oh, we'll talk to this guy and talk to this guy and talk to this guy. And it kind of becomes a chain reaction. And yeah, I guess you do end up putting a lot of trust in these people that you meet, because you don't really have much other options. So you have to kind of keep your street smarts about you.
Disha, was it hard to build rapport with the fishing community and to navigate with the kind of the local people in Karwar?
The entry point for me for any story is normally an activist, a scientist, or a local organization, or an NGO. And often I think in journalism, there's this narrative that's built that, oh, you just go to a place and you figure it out. And that's the cool thing to do, or that's the macho thing to do. I've often found that that's very impractical. You don't just go to a place, you research a place, you find out, you do pre-interviews, you do your homework well, because how do you know what you're seeing and what you're taking away from what you're seeing is actually how the local community is seeing it. You as somebody who's born brought up in a city, you have a certain feminist way of looking at things, you might not always get the perspective of the communities right, and you might not be seeing what they want you to see, or how they see it. And it's very important to constantly remember your own biases, I think. In terms of this particular fishing community, the scientist actually who who I've quoted also in the story, and who took me to these places, who acted sort of as a translator, and he translated for me as well. He's actually somebody from the community who became a scientist. And I thought that was absolutely perfect, because he himself was a bridge. Now here I want to talk about castes in India. Just like the US has the issue of race, in India you have caste, and different communities are placed differently on the caste hierarchy. And often a lot of, and so livelihoods traditionally have been tied to castes. So if you're writing about a particular community of fishermen, you're also talking about a particular caste, and it's complicated there. And so you can't be blind to that fact, because caste is not like race. You can't see it always. But caste has played a role in marginalizing people historically. So I'm very cautious of who I use as an entry point to the story. I try my best to see women, to use women, and to be able to be aware of these local nuances of caste, class, gender, And in terms of safety, it's something that I do. I make sure that somebody or the other knows where I am. I mean, when I'm in the city, I'm quite resistant to the idea of ever even letting somebody know, even within my family. Like, I'm the person who says, you know, why should I let you know if I reach somewhere, or why should I keep you posted? So I don't do that. But now I have started, like, when I was going to a remote area in Sundarbans in West Bengal on an island. And so that's the first time actually I sent my partner my Google location. And I started actively sharing it. And I said, you know, I'm going to be here for about 3 to 4 hours. And after that, I'm going to stop sharing location. But that's something that I've started doing now. But otherwise, I make sure I go by my instincts. If something, I'm not comfortable with somebody, or I feel like I'm just constantly skeptical and on my guard all the time.
Yeah. Well, I could talk to you guys all night, and I'm sure the audience would be happy to listen to you as well. We're out of time, and so I'm going to have to wrap it up here. But I just want to thank you again. Both of you are doing such important work, and I'm just so grateful that your connection with the Pulitzer Center and the University of Richmond International Education, and on behalf of the journalism department, we're really, really just so happy that you guys were able to join us and have this conversation. There were a number of questions we didn't get to in the chat, and I'm sorry about that. But I would just recommend, again, anybody that is interested in this subject, follow these folks. Follow their Twitter account, read their work. It's just groundbreaking stuff, and it's exemplary. I mean, the new generation of journalists who are coming up to meet the moment that we all find ourselves in with respect to climate change, with the environment, et cetera. It's going to take the best of all of us, and you guys are just exemplars of what we hope to bring to the party from the University of Richmond and our journalism department. So on behalf of all the above, the Pulitzer Center, International Education, Martha Merritt, who's now on screen with us, Jackie, thanks for giving us questions. Thank you all for joining us. And now you can go back to sleep.
Thank you for having us. It was really fun to revisit the project and remember, trip down our memory lane when we started this a year ago. So it's really nice. Thank you.
Oh, good. Keep up the good work. Yeah.
Same. I mean, when we were actually doing the project, we kept thinking if we can even call it an investigation, and we felt quite like imposters. But the more we do these talks, the more we feel better about the work that we've done.
It's extraordinary. It really is. It's a destroyed body of work that will live on.
Thank you.
Thanks.